The afternoon sun soaked the quiet suburb of Greenville, South Carolina, in a golden warmth that seemed to hum with promise. Lawn chairs circled fire pits, grills sizzled, and children darted across backyards, chasing each other with neon water guns. On Maple Ridge Lane, the Ross family had gathered in Gregory Ross's backyard for their annual 4th of July barbecue. Burgers smoked on the grill while Elaine Ross carried potato salad from the kitchen. Her father, Gregory, waved at neighbors while wearing his red veteran's cap and sipping sweet tea. 7-year-old Maddie, Elaine's daughter, played near the fence line, her laughter weaving through the buzzing air like music. Elaine saw her daughter twirling with a sparkler in hand, her red flip-flops kicking up bits of grass. It was a picture-perfect holiday, but beneath the surface of celebration the moment hovered on the edge of something irreversible. Elaine was tired. The divorce had drained her, and even though Gregory tried to help, the weight of raising Maddie alone still pressed on her shoulders. She turned to refill the lemonade pitcher, glancing back at the fence. In that single blink, everything she knew about her life would begin to unravel. Gregory had gone inside to get more plates. Elaine stepped back out with the lemonade, chatting with her cousin Meg and laughing about childhood memories. At some point, she glanced toward the yard again and noticed the sparkler still glowing in the grass unattended. Maddie was no longer near the fence. The swing swayed slightly as if someone had just left it. Elaine's stomach dropped. She walked briskly to the edge of the yard, calling her daughter's name. The party sounds faded into silence as her voice grew sharper, more urgent. Neighbors turned to look. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered. People scattered in different directions, calling Maddie's name. Elaine ran to the side gate and found it slightly ajar. Her hands shook as she pulled it open. One red flip-flop lay just beyond the wooden frame. Elaine picked it up as if it might explain something. Her heart pounded with panic. She screamed for Gregory, for anyone. Within 20 minutes, police arrived. An officer began asking questions as others fanned out. The neighborhood, once filled with fireworks and chatter, transformed into a grid of search zones. A holiday had become a crime scene. Detective Paula Jensen arrived before sunset. She was tall, sharp-eyed, and known for her methodical approach to missing child cases. Elaine could barely speak through her panic. She described Maddie's dress, her laugh, how she had been playing just 10 minutes before she vanished. Gregory gave his account with tears in his eyes, saying he had only stepped away briefly. A few kids mentioned seeing an ice cream truck earlier, but none could recall its name or license plate. A teenage neighbor said it had been parked longer than usual. The police traced tire marks near the curb, but found nothing conclusive. Officers knocked on every door in a 4-block radius. No one had seen Maddie leave. No one had noticed anything out of the ordinary. That night, the search expanded. Helicopters flew overhead. Volunteers combed nearby woods. Police dogs tracked scents that vanished at the road. The town watched in disbelief as the story hit local news. A girl vanished from a backyard during a barbecue and left behind only a flip-flop and silence. The next morning, Elaine sat on the floor of her father's living room, surrounded by photo albums. She flipped through pages filled with Maddie's drawings, birthday parties, and school awards. She could not stop thinking about the moment she had turned away. That tiny lapse had opened a hole in the world. Detective Jensen returned with more questions. Had Maddie ever talked to strangers? Had there been anyone new in the neighborhood? Any issues with Elaine's ex-husband? Elaine shook her head. Calvin Ross had moved out of town 6 months ago. Their split had been bitter, but not violent. He had not visited since the custody hearing. Still, police made contact. Calvin was tracked to a construction site in Georgia, where he confirmed his alibi. He had been working all day and had the timesheet and security footage to prove it. The police ruled him out. The media, however, did not. Reporters camped outside the house. Headlines hinted at parental neglect. Talk shows speculated about possible abduction scenarios. Elaine stopped answering the phone. Her world shrank to a loop of interview searches and sleepless nights staring at her daughter's empty bed. Days turned into weeks. The posters began to fade from telephone poles. Volunteers stopped calling. Tips slowed. Elaine clung to the worn drawing Maddie had made the week before. It was a picture of her with their dog and a tall tree labeled Grandpa's house. Every time Elaine closed her eyes, she saw Maddie barefoot in the grass, calling her name and reaching out. Gregory grew quieter with each passing day. He stopped mowing the lawn. He stayed up late watching the news with a blank stare. Once, he whispered that he wished he had never hosted the party. Elaine told him it was not his fault, but he shook his head. In the fall, he had a minor stroke, then another. He passed away that December in his sleep. Elaine stood alone at the graveside holding Maddie's stuffed bunny and wondering if he had died of guilt. The holidays came and went in a haze. No new evidence surfaced, no one stepped forward. A child had disappeared and the world had already begun to move on. 3 years later, Maddie's room remained untouched. Her purple blanket stayed folded on the bed. Her glittery hairbrush still sat on the dresser. Elaine had moved twice since then, but always recreated the space exactly. It became her way of preserving hope, a private museum to a life interrupted. Detective Jensen had since retired, though she occasionally called to check in. Each time she asked the same question. Did anything feel off that day? Did anyone behave strangely? Each time Elaine said no, but in quiet moments she would replay the day in her mind, examining every second for things she might have missed. A glance, a silence, a car that passed too slowly. None of it led anywhere. By 2022, the case had gone cold. Yet Elaine still kept a framed photo of Maddie on her nightstand, still wrote a birthday card every July, and placed it in a locked box. She had learned to function, but never to let go. Something inside her still believed that the truth had not been buried forever. It was waiting somewhere, and one day it would surface. The morning after Maddie vanished, the Greenville Police Department set up a formal command center near Gregory's property. Folding tables were covered in maps, radio scanners buzzed with dispatch traffic, and officers worked in shifts searching the surrounding neighborhoods. Detective Paula Jensen reviewed every hour of the timeline from the moment Maddie was last seen. Elaine sat across from her at the station, wrapped in a blanket though the summer heat lingered. Her voice trembled as she repeated her account again, the same details, the same time gaps, the same haunting image of the red flip-flop by the gate. The case gained local traction quickly, and national outlets began airing short segments. Detectives followed every lead, every sighting, every vehicle report. A caller claimed to have seen a girl matching Maddie's description at a rest stop along Interstate 85, but security cameras showed nothing. Someone else suggested checking nearby woods, though the search dogs had already cleared those areas. The number of false leads multiplied, and over the following weeks the investigation began to stall. A missing child's face still flashed across the evening news, but the urgency had shifted. People moved on. Elaine could not. By the end of July, a registered sex offender named Thomas Reeve was arrested less than a mile from the Ross property. He had been living in a rented trailer and working night shifts at a gas station. A tip came from a woman who claimed he had stared too long at children in a grocery store. Police took no chances. They brought him in, searched his home, confiscated his computer, and questioned him for hours. Elaine was notified of the arrest, and for a moment she dared to hope. But after a thorough investigation, it was clear he had no connection to Maddie's disappearance. His digital footprint confirmed that he had been online during the time of the barbecue. Surveillance from the gas station placed him there, clocking in before the incident. The detective in charge called Elaine personally to explain apologizing for raising her expectations. Elaine stared at the wall, barely responding. She had stopped crying weeks ago. It was not that the pain had eased. It had simply grown so large that it became quiet, a silence deeper than grief. Later that month, an anonymous tip led officers to the church Maddie had attended with her grandparents. Behind the main building was an old tool shed used for gardening equipment. It sat under a tangle of trees and had not been opened in years. A janitor had remembered hearing something unusual in the weeks after Maddie vanished, something like tapping, but he had dismissed it at the time. Now, faced with a child still missing, he came forward. Police arrived with bolt cutters and opened the shed. Inside was a collection of rusty tools, a lawnmower, and tucked behind it all a pink school backpack. Elaine was called to the station to identify it. Her heart pounded as she stared at the object on the table. It looked like Maddie's same shape, same shade, same worn fabric. But when she opened it, everything inside had been wiped clean. No books, no drawings, no name tag, no fingerprints. Just a faint scent of fabric softener and a small white eraser with a smiley face. Elaine stepped back, shaking her head. It was hers. She knew it, but there was nothing that could prove it. Despite the lack of evidence, the discovery reignited a surge of hope. The media latched onto the church shed story, airing interviews with Elaine law enforcement and even childhood friends of Maddie. For a week, it felt like the momentum had returned. People volunteered to research areas already combed months earlier. Dogs were brought back in. A new poster campaign was launched with updated renderings of what Maddie might look like now. But as quickly as the attention returned, it faded again. The church shed held no forensic value, no DNA, no fingerprints. Nothing could tie it to Maddie with certainty. Detective Jensen told Elaine that they would not give up, but she could hear the weariness in her voice. The detectives were exhausted. Elaine was exhausted. Tips dried up. The photo renderings were shared online but received little engagement. The story had aged. The public had moved on. Even the investigators had begun turning to other cases, other children. Elaine understood it, but it hurt just the same. By early September, 2 months after Maddie disappeared, the town of Greenville had returned to routine. Children went back to school. Stores put up autumn displays. Halloween costumes appeared in windows. Elaine could not walk past the aisles without thinking of Maddie and her fairy wings from the year before. She stopped going to the grocery store altogether. Neighbors no longer knew what to say. Some avoided her entirely, ashamed or uncomfortable. Others tried to be kind, but their efforts felt hollow. A few even suggested she try to move on. Elaine did not respond to those comments. Her life now revolved around a single timeline split in two. Before the backyard, after the backyard. There was nothing else. Detective Jensen met with her once a week, sometimes twice, reviewing every detail again and again. But they both knew they were circling the same dead ends. Nothing led forward. There were no new paths to follow. Just the echo of a missing voice that no one could seem to find. Gregory Ross tried to keep up appearances in the months that followed, but those close to him saw the toll. He stopped attending church. He stopped hosting his card games. He began to forget things small at first, then larger. Once, he drove halfway across town and forgot why he was there. Elaine scheduled a doctor visit. The diagnosis came back as early-stage vascular dementia, likely accelerated by trauma and stress. Gregory began writing lists for himself, reminders of daily tasks, names of people, routines. But it did not stop the decline. By Thanksgiving, he was forgetting to eat. Elaine moved in temporarily to care for him. In quiet moments, she would catch him standing at the fence where Maddie disappeared, staring into the trees as if waiting for her to return. In December, Gregory suffered a heart attack. He passed away before the ambulance could reach the house. Elaine sat beside his body until the coroner arrived, holding his hand and whispering apologies for all the things left unsaid. The grief of losing him layered itself over the already unbearable weight of losing Maddie. But even then, she did not stop searching. With Gregory gone and the investigation frozen, Elaine began her own search. She kept every file, every photo, every printed map. She created a timeline, highlighted names, cross-referenced license plates. She requested surveillance footage from gas station stores and traffic cameras from July 4th. Most of it had been erased or overwritten by that point. She emailed amateur sleuth forums. She joined online communities for families of missing children. She talked with mothers who had waited 10 years, 15 years, even 20 before finding answers. Some had never found them. Still, they understood her. They did not ask her to move on. They understood that time did not heal anything. It only deepened the ache. Elaine created a small website called findmaddieross.org. She posted pictures, shared updates, and wrote a journal of her memories. The entries were raw, filled with guilt and longing. Strangers commented, some offered support, others offered theories, but no one offered the truth, that Elaine would have to find herself. In the months that followed Gregory's funeral, Elaine continued to live in his house on Maple Ridge Lane. It was not because she felt comfortable there, but because she could not bring herself to leave the last place Maddie had played. The backyard remained untouched. The swing still hung from the maple tree. The old patio table still had the faded 4th of July decorations. Elaine found herself pacing the hallway at night, unable to sleep, sometimes pausing in the doorway of Maddie's old room. The silence felt alive, pressing against her chest. The guilt never left her. She kept wondering if she had just looked sooner, if she'd kept Maddie inside longer, if she had never turned her back to refill the lemonade. It was in that fog of grief and doubt that Elaine received a certified letter from her ex-husband's attorney. Calvin Ross had filed a motion for shared custody of Maddie's remains. Elaine read the letter twice, stunned by the implication. She had not even held a funeral. There were no remains to speak of. She felt the sting not only of Calvin's intrusion, but of the cold legal phrasing that reduced their daughter to a possession. Elaine called Calvin that evening, and though the conversation began with strained civility, it quickly unraveled. He blamed her for the disappearance, saying that if Maddie had been with him that weekend, none of this would have happened. Elaine fired back with her own accusations, reminding him how he had vanished after the divorce, barely calling never visiting. Calvin claimed he had stayed away out of respect, that Elaine had made it impossible for him to be part of Maddie's life. Old wounds opened wider, and the conversation ended with Elaine throwing the phone across the room. That night, she pulled out a folder of Maddie's school reports and found a drawing from the last day of kindergarten. It showed a stick-figure family, a girl with yellow hair, a mom with a blue dress, and a dad holding a hammer. It had once made her smile. Now it made her cry. The legal battle dragged on for months, with both sides filing paperwork, exchanging harsh letters, and attending court-mandated mediation sessions that led nowhere. There was no peace, only prolonged pain. In one of the hearings, Calvin presented a medical report Elaine had not expected. Gregory Ross's early-stage dementia diagnosis was now official evidence. Calvin's lawyer used it to argue that Gregory had not been a reliable guardian the day Maddie vanished. He suggested that Gregory might have forgotten to latch the gate, or could have even wandered away, leaving Maddie unattended. Elaine sat in the courtroom stunned. It was true Gregory had been ill, but he had always loved Maddie. He had been careful, he had been present. Elaine stood and told the court that Gregory had been trying his best, that he had never neglected Maddie. Her voice cracked but remained steady. Calvin remained impassive, arms crossed, gaze fixed forward. The judge deferred the decision, and the next hearing was scheduled for late spring. Elaine left the courthouse with trembling hands and a tightening chest. She sat in her car for nearly an hour before driving home. She began to realize that Maddie's disappearance had not only stolen her daughter, it had dismantled the fragile connections that once held their family together. That spring, Elaine began sorting through Gregory's belongings. It was a task she had delayed for too long. She opened dusty boxes in the attic, pulled old files from cabinets, and sifted through notebooks filled with his uneven handwriting. In one worn manila folder marked July 2002, she found clippings from local newspapers about Maddie's case notes from his own interviews with neighbors and a map of the block with red ink circles around specific houses. Gregory had kept his own investigation. Elaine unfolded a loose page that listed delivery vans seen in the neighborhood that day. She recognized a few names, but one stood out. It read, Mercer's Lawn and Pool, with a question mark beside it. Elaine had never heard of them. She searched online and found that the business had closed years ago. She filed it away in her mind, unsure what to do with it. She knew from her own late-night research that abductions often involved people familiar with the child's environment. someone who knew the layout, someone who could watch without suspicion. By summer, the court ordered both Elaine and Calvin to attend co-parenting therapy, a cruel bureaucratic decision considering there was no child left to co-parent. The sessions were tense, mostly silent. The therapist tried to guide them into conversations about shared grief, but neither of them responded well. Calvin believed Elaine's obsession with the case had destroyed any chance of rebuilding their lives. Elaine believed Calvin's absence during the first crucial months of the investigation meant he forfeited any right to speak on Maddie's behalf. The final session ended in an argument that left both of them walking out of the building in opposite directions. Calvin had moved back to Greenville the previous year, taking a job with a regional construction company. He now lived just 6 miles away from the house on Maple Ridge, yet he and Elaine lived as strangers. They only communicated through attorneys. Elaine began to suspect that his interest in the case had more to do with guilt than love, though she could not be sure. The more she thought about him, the more uncertain she became about what he had truly known or seen during their final months as a family. One evening in July, exactly 1 year after Gregory's death, Elaine received an envelope in her mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, old and faded, showing Maddie on a playground. Elaine had never seen that photo before. Maddie wore a red hoodie and jeans, and her expression was unreadable. The background was unfamiliar. A sticker on the back read November 2002. Elaine's heart skipped. She called Detective Jensen, who had retired 6 months earlier. Jensen agreed to meet. They sat on a park bench near the station. Jensen studied the photo, then pulled out a small magnifier. She said the image looked authentic. The timestamp matched the type used by a common brand of disposable cameras in the early 2000s. It was not conclusive proof of anything, but it raised questions. If Maddie had been alive in November, it meant she had not died immediately. Someone had kept her. Elaine could not sleep for days. She placed the photo in a glass frame and set it beside the original on her nightstand. 2 pictures. One before the barbecue, one possibly after. Her mind refused to rest. Elaine began cross-referencing every detail again. She returned to the church, walked the path behind the shed, spoke to people who had moved away since the search began. She contacted every delivery company that operated in Greenville in 2002. She revisited Gregory's notes and highlighted the entry about Mercer's lawn and pool. After hours of searching public business records, she found a related name, Raymond Mercer. He had registered a landscaping business in 2000 and dissolved it in 2004. She'd found a local address listed to his name from 20 years ago. Elaine sat still for a moment, processing. Then she called the police tip line and gave the information. The next day, Detective Lisa Carter, who had replaced Jensen, called Elaine and thanked her. They would look into it. Elaine hung up and whispered Maddie's name. It was the first time in years that she felt something close to movement. Detective Lisa Carter arrived at Elaine's home on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The clouds hung low and a steady drizzle coated the street in a soft silver hue. Elaine met her on the porch holding the photo of Maddie in her hand. Carter stepped inside, shaking water from her jacket, and immediately began asking questions. Elaine laid out everything she had found, including Gregory's handwritten notes, the old business registration for Mercer's lawn and pool, and the most recent address she had discovered online. Carter took notes carefully, her tone measured but interested. She admitted that when she inherited the case from Jensen, she had not expected any movement. Most cold cases sat dormant until new technology or a confession shook something loose. But this was different. This was legwork. This was personal. Carter promised to check the address and dig deeper into Raymond Mercer's background. As she left, Elaine stood at the window watching her drive off through the mist. It had been so long since anyone had taken her seriously. The feeling was both hopeful and terrifying. The next morning, Carter called. She had run Mercer's name through DMV records and found that he now lived in Columbia, South Carolina, roughly 2 hours from Greenville. He worked as a long-haul truck driver for a regional shipping company and had no known criminal record. Still, Carter found it odd that he had closed his landscaping business in 2004 with no forwarding details. She requested a voluntary interview and drove to his current residence. According to her report, Mercer greeted her politely, seemed cooperative, and answered questions without hesitation. He claimed to remember the Ross neighborhood. He said he had done lawn treatments for several homes on that street, including the yard next door to Gregory's. He said he remembered hearing about Maddie's disappearance on the news, but he had not known the family personally. Carter noted that he had no clear memory of where he had been on the day in question, but she also acknowledged that 20 years had passed. She collected his basic contact details and left. Elaine read the report twice, uncertain whether it provided comfort or concern. That night, Elaine sat with the report open in front of her and a steaming mug of tea in her hand. The fireplace crackled softly in the background, but her focus was fixed on one sentence in particular. Mercer had no recollection of Maddie or of speaking to anyone at the Ross house. That stood in direct contrast to something Gregory had written. In one of his notes, dated July 12, 2002, he described seeing a man in a green truck parked along the side street that ran behind their backyard. He wrote that the truck had a Mercer's lawn and pool decal on the side, and that the man had waved to him as he pulled away. Gregory had underlined the word waved. Elaine knew her father had not been the kind of man to exaggerate details. If he had seen something, it mattered. She called Detective Carter again and relayed the entry. Carter listened carefully and said she would request old utility records and any work invoices tied to Mercer's business in that area. Elaine thanked her and hung up. The tea had gone cold. Over the next several days, Carter pursued the trail. She'd pulled archived bank statements from Mercer's closed account, scanned property records, and contacted a former employee who had worked with him during the early 2000s. The employee, a man named Daniel Pike, confirmed that Mercer had occasionally taken jobs solo, especially in the summer when business was slow. He recalled hearing about the missing girl, but had no memory of Mercer reacting one way or another. Carter pressed further and asked if Mercer had ever mentioned the Ross house or the barbecue. Pike said no. Still, the conversation stirred something in Carter. She submitted a request for a full background check and began reviewing any 911 calls made near Maple Ridge Lane in the months following Maddie's disappearance. Most were unrelated. One, however, stood out. In September 2002, a call had come in from an elderly resident reporting a suspicious man parked on the street behind Gregory's house late at night. The responding officer had found nothing. The report listed the vehicle as a green pickup truck with no visible plates. Elaine received this update the following week. Her hands trembled as she read the report, her mind racing through the implications. If the same green truck had been spotted more than once, it suggested someone had returned. She wondered if that person had been watching the house. Watching her, watching Maddie before the disappearance. She looked through Gregory's notes again and found a drawing he had made, a crude sketch of the street, with 2 X marks, one near the gate and one farther down the alley. She felt a jolt of recognition. That second X aligned with the place where the truck had been parked according to the police report. It was a chilling detail. Gregory had been trying to map something to document movement. Elaine ran her fingers over the paper and whispered his name. She wished he had lived long enough to see someone take his work seriously. As Detective Carter continued her research, she uncovered one more detail that unsettled her. A property deed listed under Raymond Mercer's name had been active until 2008. It was a small parcel of land in the foothills near Saluda, roughly 90 minutes from Greenville. It was registered as recreational property undeveloped. Mercer had sold it quietly without a public listing. Carter drove out to the location with a county official. They found a padlocked gate, a gravel driveway, and a clearing at the end of the path. There was no house, no electricity. Just an old fire pit, some worn tire tracks, and a half-buried plastic crate filled with empty water bottles, granola wrappers, and a broken camping chair. Carter took photographs and requested a forensic team to examine the site. It could be nothing, or it could be the first real link they had found in years. She returned to her office with the photos and added them to the case file. That night, she called Elaine and described what she had seen. Elaine sat in silence, holding the phone, unable to speak. She pictured Maddie alone in the woods. In early October, the forensic results came back. No DNA, no identifiable fingerprints, but the crate itself had been purchased from a local hardware store in Greenville. The receipt, when matched with store records, showed a purchase date of July 3, 2002. That detail shook Carter. She called Mercer back in for another interview, but this time she was more direct. She asked about the Saluda property. He claimed it had been a weekend retreat spot for him and his brother. He said they used it for hunting. When pressed about the plastic crate, he shrugged and said they often left supplies out there. Carter asked for the name of the brother. Mercer hesitated before saying he had lost touch with him years ago. The tension in the room was palpable. Carter made detailed notes and added them to the file. She had no arrest warrant. She had no conclusive proof. But her instincts told her something was wrong. She told Mercer they might follow up and let him go. He walked out calmly, without looking back. The leaves had begun to turn by late October, and Greenville settled into the rhythm of early autumn. Detective Carter continued following the thin trail left by Mercer. The property near Saluda offered no conclusive proof, but Carter believed something had once taken place there, something carefully cleaned and abandoned. She requested a court order to obtain any rental or storage facility contracts Mercer had signed in the years surrounding Maddie's disappearance. It was a long shot, but she needed to know where he might have stored tools, equipment, or anything he would not keep at home. The court approved the motion, and within days she had a list of locations Mercer had used for storage between 2002 and 2006. One address caught her attention. It belonged to a storage facility on the south edge of Greenville, a rundown property with rusted fencing and broken light fixtures. The records showed that Mercer had rented Unit 113 from August 2002 to January 2006. Carter called the facility immediately and learned that the unit had been cleared out years ago, but the former manager, now retired, still lived nearby and kept paper records in his basement. Detective Carter drove to the small house where the former manager, Thomas Rayner, greeted her with a skeptical eye. He had thick glasses, a trembling voice, and the cautious manner of someone who had seen too much of life and trusted too little. When Carter explained her investigation and showed her badge, Rayner slowly nodded and invited her in. The basement smelled of dust and old cardboard. Stacks of binders lined the walls. He pulled the 2002 binder and opened to a section marked Unit 113. There was a yellowed form signed by Mercer along with a payment log that showed consistent rent through 2005. Carter asked if he remembered the tenant. Rayner said yes. He remembered Mercer because he had requested the unit at the far end, the one most hidden from view. Carter asked if he had ever seen the contents. Rayner said only once during a routine inspection. He remembered the unit was always meticulously locked. One afternoon, Mercer had left it ajar, and Rayner peeked in. He saw a large wooden trunk, a red tricycle, and several boxes labeled with dates. He had thought it strange, but not alarming. Carter asked if any photos had been taken during that inspection. Rayner shook his head, but mentioned that Mercer had left behind one item when he vacated the unit. A metal locker had been too heavy to move. It had remained in a side corridor for years before finally being discarded. Carter asked if the locker had ever been opened. Rayner said no. It had been locked tight, and no one wanted to break into it. Carter requested permission to examine the facility, and Rayner agreed. They drove over together, walking through the cracked pavement and sagging gates. The current owner allowed Carter access to the back corridors. She noted how isolated Unit 113 had been. Rayner pointed to a narrow storage bay beside the old utility closet. That was where the locker had sat for years. The locker was gone now, but Carter noticed a square outline on the floor where the dust settled differently. She knelt and ran her fingers over the faint impressions. She stood slowly, mind turning. She asked the owner if they had any old disposal records. The owner shrugged and offered to check. The next day, Carter received an email from the facility's office assistant. Attached was a scanned disposal log dated February 2006. It listed one item under the notes section. It read, "Large steel locker with padlock no claim disposed via Junk To Go hauling service." Carter contacted Junk To Go, and after several calls and transfers, she found that the company had changed ownership twice. Eventually, a supervisor located a 2006 manifest for a Greenville pickup. The report showed the locker had not been scrapped immediately. It had been moved to a temporary holding site outside Traveler's Rest. The location still existed and now operated as a commercial junk processing yard. Carter made the drive without waiting for backup. The sun had begun to set when she arrived, casting long shadows across the yard. A worker led her to the rear section where discarded containers had been stacked for resale. After an hour of searching, she found a steel locker, rusted and streaked with grime, marked with a faded number that matched the manifest. She ran her hand over the surface. It was locked. The yard manager allowed Carter to cut the padlock. It broke with a loud snap, and she slowly opened the door. Inside was a stack of papers wrapped in plastic, several VHS tapes labeled with dates, a sealed envelope, and a small pink sneaker. Carter stared at the sneaker. Her breath caught. She called the Greenville Police Department and requested an immediate forensics team. She stood watch over the locker until the team arrived. Within an hour, the items were bagged, tagged, and on their way to the lab. Carter drove back in silence, headlights flickering against the dark roads. She knew she had found something important. That night, she called Elaine. Her voice was calm, but her words were careful. She told her that evidence had been recovered from an old storage locker tied to Raymond Mercer. Elaine asked what kind of evidence. Carter said they would not speculate yet. She said tests were being done and that she would call again once the lab results came back. Elaine said nothing for a long moment. Then she whispered thank you. The forensic analysis took 4 days. The plastic wrapping had preserved the papers and tapes well. The tapes contained hours of static broken by brief segments of home footage. One showed a child playing with blocks in a dimly lit room. Another showed someone reading a story aloud. The voice was male. The child's face never appeared fully, but her clothes matched those worn by Maddie in old photographs. The sneaker was a size that Maddie had worn. The papers included receipts, sketches of a room layout, and a calendar with July 2002 circled in red ink. The envelope contained a grainy photo of Maddie asleep on a mattress beside a small table lamp. She looked older than she had in her last school portrait. Detective Carter reviewed everything twice before compiling a formal report. The contents were shared with the district attorney. A decision was made to move forward. That evening, Carter returned to Elaine's house with a folder in her hand. She explained what had been found. Elaine sat in her living room, hands clasped in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor. Elaine did not ask to see the tapes. She asked only one question. Was it really her daughter? Carter said they could not confirm without DNA testing, but based on the objects and footage, the evidence strongly suggested that Maddie had been alive after her disappearance. Elaine exhaled slowly. It sounded more like a release than a breath. She stood and walked to Maddie's framed school photo. She stared at it for a long time, then turned to Carter and asked what would happen next. Carter said they would bring in Mercer for questioning. She explained that the district attorney had authorized a search warrant for his current residence, and if they found anything there, they would proceed with charges. Elaine nodded. She asked Carter to keep her updated. As the detective left, Elaine remained at the window again, watching the evening creep in. The streets were quiet. The porch light flickered. In her chest, the ache pulsed stronger than ever. But now, at last, it pulsed in rhythm with something real. Detective Carter began her day early, the folder of evidence from the locker still fresh in her mind. The tapes, the child's sneaker, and the handwritten calendar all pointed to one thing. Someone had kept Maddie hidden for a significant period of time, but why and how remained unanswered. Carter submitted an urgent request for DNA testing on the sneaker's inner lining and sent the tapes for audio analysis. While waiting for results, she turned her attention back to the neighborhood. The old paper trail had led them to Mercer, but if Maddie had been kept in the Greenville area initially, someone had to have seen something. Carter requested a list of residents who had lived on Maple Ridge Lane in 2002. Most of the names had already been checked. One name near the property line stood out. It belonged to Raymond Mercer's cousin, Robert Dean Holt, who had lived 3 doors down from Gregory Ross at the time of Maddie's disappearance. Carter had not previously linked him to Mercer, but when she ran his name again, the connection appeared in a background report. That changed everything. Carter visited the address listed in Robert Holt's old file and found it now belonged to someone else. The current residents confirmed Holt had moved out around 2005. A forwarding address led her to a trailer park outside Spartanburg. She drove there that afternoon and knocked on the dented door of Lot 17. Holt answered in jeans and a stained flannel shirt, his eyes heavy, his frame thinner than his ID photo suggested. Carter identified herself and asked if he remembered Maddie Ross. He paused before nodding slowly. He said he remembered the little girl disappearing and how the whole block had been shaken by it. Carter pressed further, asking about Mercer. Holt hesitated, then admitted he and Mercer had not spoken in years. When she asked if Mercer had ever visited the house, Holt scratched his chin and said maybe once or twice. Carter's instincts told her he was withholding something. She kept her voice calm and asked if Mercer had ever left anything at his house. Holt looked away. Carter told him she needed to know. Holt eventually led her to a dusty shed behind the trailer. He fumbled with a padlock and opened the door, revealing boxes stacked against the wall. In the back corner was a plastic bin marked Books. Carter asked to open it. Inside were several children's books, a soft toy bunny with a torn ear, and a spiral notebook with rainbow stickers on the cover. Carter picked it up and flipped through the pages. The handwriting started with shaky letters and grew more confident across the pages. Each entry began with the same name, Maddie. Carter asked how the bin had come to be there. Holt shifted uncomfortably and said Mercer had asked him to store it years ago. He claimed he never looked inside. Carter bagged the notebook and the toy. She told Holt he might be called in for formal questioning. He nodded but said little. Back in her car, Carter opened her phone and left a message for Elaine. Her hands were steady, but her stomach churned. Every new piece of evidence brought them closer, but it also deepened the horror. That evening, Carter sat at her desk and read through the notebook. The entries were written in a child's voice. They talked about daily routines, favorite foods books read, and dreams about going home. One entry mentioned a man named Ray who brought food and told stories. Another described a room with pink curtains and drawings taped to the wall. The last few pages showed a shift. The handwriting became more frantic. The words grew shorter. The final entry was dated March 12, 2005. It read simply, "I want to go home now." Carter closed the notebook and rubbed her forehead. The lab results on the sneaker came back the next day. The DNA matched Maddie's profile. It was confirmed. She had been alive well past her disappearance date. Carter requested a formal search warrant for Mercer's home and a summons for Robert Holt. The investigation was no longer speculative. It was now a matter of connecting a confirmed victim to her captors. Elaine arrived at the station later that afternoon. She had not slept well since hearing about the storage locker. Carter brought her into a private room and handed her a printed page from the notebook. She explained where it had been found and whose property it had been stored on. Elaine read the words slowly, her hand covering her mouth as she fought back emotion. She asked if she could keep the page. Carter said yes. Elaine asked if Maddie had written it. Carter nodded. The confirmation hit Elaine like a wave. Maddie had written those words. Maddie had lived long enough to describe her days. Elaine began to weep. She leaned forward in her chair, shoulders shaking, but did not break completely. Carter sat with her silently, understanding that the moment did not need words. They were past the point of speculation. They were now inside the truth, and the truth carried its own weight. The next morning, officers served the warrant on Mercer's residence. They entered the modest two-story house and conducted a full search. In the basement, they found several sealed boxes labeled with dates from 2002 to 2006. Inside were receipts, audio cassettes, and maintenance logs from the landscaping business. One box contained photographs. Most were landscape shots, homes with well-trimmed lawns and backyards viewed from odd angles. Among them was a photo of Maddie's backyard taken from behind the fence. Carter stared at the image, noting the date scrawled in ink on the back. June 30th, 2002, days before the disappearance. The photograph was taken from the alley where Gregory had noted the green truck. It confirmed that someone had been watching, that someone had made a plan, that someone had waited. Mercer was taken into custody without incident. He said little as he was led into the interrogation room. Carter sat across from him, her tone firm. She showed him the photograph. She showed him the notebook. She showed him the tapes and the receipts. He blinked slowly, but refused to speak. Carter told him they had evidence placing Maddie in a hidden location. She told him they had proof she had been alive for nearly 3 years after her disappearance. Mercer stared at the table. When asked directly if he had taken Maddie, he remained silent. His attorney requested the interview be terminated. Carter stood and left the room. She had not expected a confession. What she needed now was a full timeline. She needed to reconstruct what had happened during those 3 missing years. She needed to understand why Holt had stored the bin. She needed to know if Maddie had ever been seen outside, if anyone else had known. Elaine was notified of the arrest the following morning. She sat on her porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders as the officer gave her the news. Her response was quiet. She said she had imagined this moment many times. She had not imagined it would feel like this. There was no relief, only confirmation of pain. She asked if Mercer had spoken. The officer said no. Elaine nodded. She understood silence. She had lived with it for 20 years. That night, she walked into Maddie's room and sat on the floor. She took the framed photo and the notebook page and placed them beside each other. And then she whispered Maddie's name. It was the only word she had the strength to say. Detective Carter returned to the Saluda property the morning after Mercer's arrest. She was accompanied by a forensic team and 2 officers from the district attorney's office. This time, they brought ground-penetrating radar equipment and authorization to excavate the surrounding area. The air was cold and sharp. Frost lingered on the tall grass lining the property's edge. Carter stood by the clearing where the old fire pit remained and watched the team set up their tools. The earlier visit had revealed general disturbance, but nothing definitive. Now they were prepared to look deeper. The device moved methodically across the ground, sending back signals that mapped the subsurface. It took nearly 3 hours before a technician paused, crouched, and marked a rectangular anomaly, roughly 5 feet beneath the soil. Carter walked over slowly. The technician explained that the signal suggested the presence of a large container. Carter gave the nod. The team began digging. The soil was dense and cold. Shovels worked steadily, layer by layer, until the edge of something hard and flat appeared through the earth. A plastic tarp was peeled back. Beneath it was the top of a wooden chest. The team cleared the surrounding soil and lifted the lid of the chest carefully. Inside were objects arranged with disturbing precision. A small mattress discolored by time, a doll with one glass eye, a faded red hoodie with a broken zipper. The air inside the chest was stale but dry. There were no human remains, but everything inside suggested the chest had been prepared for long-term use. Carter noticed the hoodie immediately. It matched the one Maddie had worn in the photograph discovered inside the storage locker. A closer inspection revealed that the interior walls of the chest had been lined with insulation foam, as if someone had attempted to soundproof it. A faded towel lay folded at the base. On the underside of the lid, someone had carved initials into the wood. They read, Mr. Carter's stomach turned. She stepped back and radioed for photographs. Everything would be taken into custody. This chest, even without remains, was evidence. The implications were clear. Someone had prepared a place to hold a child. Someone had come back here more than once. Detective Carter called Elaine personally. She explained what had been found at the Saluda site. Elaine listened in silence. Carter described the chest, the clothing, and the carvings. Elaine asked only one question. Was it Maddie's hoodie? Carter said they could not confirm yet, but the details matched. Elaine said she remembered buying it at a discount store during a cold snap in 2001. Maddie had worn it on a field trip to the zoo. She had refused to take it off for weeks. Elaine's voice broke then. She apologized and hung up. Carter sat in her office for a long time after the call, staring at the evidence photos. The child's presence was everywhere in the items they found, but her absence screamed louder. It was clear that Mercer had taken careful steps to conceal this part of his life. He had isolated his victim. He had controlled the environment. Carter began building a timeline starting from the days before the disappearance to the moment of the arrest. The cabin had become a second stage, a place of extended captivity. It answered some questions but raised even more. The district attorney scheduled a case review meeting for the following week. Prosecutors, forensic analysts, and detectives gathered to determine the strength of the charges. The evidence now spanned multiple locations: the storage unit, the cousin's shed, the cabin in Saluda, all pieces aligned around a central pattern. Mercer had stalked Maddie's home. He had studied the family's routines. He had used his landscaping business to familiarize himself with the neighborhood, and once he had taken Maddie, he had created spaces to keep her hidden. But one element remained elusive. The end. If Maddie had been alive in 2005, where had she gone? What had finally happened? Prosecutors wanted clarity. Carter knew the case was strong but incomplete. She returned to the cabin site to walk the perimeter again. The terrain sloped westward, ending in a creek bed choked with roots. Along the edge, partially hidden by brush, she found a rusted metal bucket with a lid. She called for gloves and opened it. Inside were ashes and partially burned documents. She pulled out a warped strip of photo paper. The corner showed a girl's shoe. Then the image dissolved. Back at the lab, technicians reconstructed what they could from the burned fragments. One document had survived enough to reveal a name: Maddie Ross. The paper appeared to be a drawing, likely made by a child. The rest of the bucket's contents were too damaged to identify. Carter added the ash bucket to the evidence file. She requested search warrants for every vehicle Mercer had registered between 2002 and 2006. Only one stood out: a white panel van registered in 2001 and sold for parts in 2006. The sale record listed a salvage yard in Augusta, Georgia. Carter contacted the yard. By some stroke of fortune, the frame had never been scrapped. The van had been stripped of major parts and left to rust at the back of the property. She drove down with a technician. They found it wedged between stacks of discarded machinery. The interior had been gutted, but the technician pulled back the floor panel and discovered embedded hair strands and fragments of cloth. The samples were collected and returned to the lab. Carter left the yard knowing she had found the vehicle used in Maddie's abduction. Elaine received the update about the van 2 days later. She sat at her kitchen table, the evidence photo laid out beside a cup of untouched coffee. She had reached a point where the discoveries no longer surprised her. They only added layers to the grief she had carried for years. Carter told her they were closing in. The district attorney's office believed they had enough for a full trial. Elaine nodded slowly. She asked if there was any indication of when Maddie had died. Carter said the question remained open. They had no remains, no confirmed date. Only a long silence followed by a series of objects left behind like echoes. Elaine whispered that she still dreamed of Maddie sometimes. She said in the dreams Maddie was older, standing in a doorway asking why she had been left behind. Carter said they would find every answer they could. Then she hung up. That night, Elaine packed away the photos into a wooden box and placed it in the closet. She needed them close, but not on display. The pain had become sharp again. The hope had turned into weight. The following week, Detective Carter interviewed Mercer's cousin, Robert Holt, again. This time, Holt arrived with an attorney. His demeanor had changed. He looked worn down his shoulders, hunched. Carter asked again about the bin stored in his shed. Holt claimed he had not known what was inside. Carter asked about the chest in the cabin. Holt said he had never been there. Then Carter showed him a photograph taken from Gregory Ross's backyard. Holt flinched. Carter said the angle matched the view from Holt's second-floor window. She asked if Holt had ever seen Mercer watching the backyard. Holt said nothing. Carter leaned forward and asked if he had ever heard a child crying in that house. Holt looked down. Then he asked to speak with his attorney. After 10 minutes, the attorney returned alone. He said Holt was prepared to provide a sworn statement under limited immunity. Carter listened carefully. Holt claimed that Mercer had visited him in the summer of 2002 and asked for a favor. He had never asked questions. He had never entered the storage unit. But once he had driven Mercer to the cabin and waited outside for nearly an hour. Detective Carter sat in her office long after sunset staring at the handwritten statement Robert Holt had provided. The pages outlined the single visit to the Saluda cabin in July 2002. According to Holt, Mercer had been secretive and anxious, instructing him to wait in the car and promising it would not take long. Holt claimed he never saw a child and never went inside. He said Mercer returned after 40 minutes silent and visibly tense, carrying what looked like a duffel bag and a small box. He never told Holt what was inside. That trip remained unspoken between them for years. Carter reviewed the timeline again, highlighting every verifiable date. She had Maddie's disappearance on July 4, 2002. She had the lease date on the storage unit in August. The storage unit contained items dated through late 2005. She had the last notebook entry from Maddie on March 12, 2005. If accurate, that meant Maddie had lived for nearly 3 years in captivity. Carter turned the pages back and forth. Each artifact revealed presence, each timestamp narrowed the frame. Still, the moment when Maddie ceased to appear in the record had not yet been located. The autopsy report on the mattress found inside the wooden chest revealed faint traces of hair and skin cells. The DNA matched Maddie. That detail established that she had indeed spent time inside the Saluda cabin. The forensic specialist could not determine the duration, but the hair was embedded into the fibers deeply enough to suggest extended use. There was no blood, no bodily fluids indicating injury. The environment had been cleaned, but not perfectly. Carter added the findings to the evidence binder, which now stretched to nearly 3 inches thick. She sent another request to the Georgia salvage yard for any recovered materials from inside the van. The results came in 2 days later. One fabric fiber embedded beneath the van's passenger seat matched the hoodie found in the cabin chest. Carter marked the date, November 2004. That meant the van was used to transport Maddie at least 2 years after the abduction. Someone had moved her from one place to another and had done so more than once. The mounting evidence began to suggest a shift in location sometime in early 2005. Carter expanded her scope. She reviewed utility records near the cabin, tracking unusual spikes or drops in water and electricity usage. One pattern emerged. Between March and April 2005, electricity usage dropped to 0 for 3 months. This coincided with the final notebook entry Maddie had written. Carter requested an aerial scan from the state's Historic Survey Office. The oldest available image dated back to June 2005 and showed the cabin with boarded windows and overgrowth creeping across the lot. There was no sign of human activity. She forwarded the image to the district attorney. It now seemed clear that Mercer had abandoned the cabin not long after Maddie's final entry. But what happened in that gap between March and June? Carter returned to the interview room with Robert Holt. She asked if Mercer had ever contacted him in 2005. Holt admitted he received a call in the spring. Mercer had asked if he still had an empty freezer in his garage. Holt said yes. He never asked why. 2 weeks later, the freezer disappeared. Elaine sat at her kitchen table surrounded by clippings, printouts, and photographs. She had received a call from Carter earlier that day. The detective told her the timeline had shifted. Maddie had been moved. Elaine stared at the final notebook entry again. The words, "I want to go home now," echoed through her thoughts. She remembered the month vividly. That March, she had organized a candlelight vigil in Gregory's backyard. She had stood in front of neighbors and reporters and begged for answers. At the same time, Maddie had still been alive somewhere, writing in a notebook, asking to come home. Elaine felt the ache deep in her chest. She called Carter again and asked if there was any indication of where Maddie had gone next. Carter told her they were working on it. She said there was no confirmed burial site, no death certificate, no remains. Elaine said she understood. Then she asked the question she had asked so many times. Did she suffer? Carter said they had no evidence of direct harm, but the conditions Maddie lived in were isolating. Elaine whispered thank you and ended the call. Carter continued piecing together digital breadcrumbs. She reviewed Mercer's bank records and found a single cash withdrawal of $600 in March 2005 from a rural ATM located in Lawrence County. The surveillance footage had been erased years ago, but the withdrawal was a red flag. Carter drove out to the area and spoke with locals. One gas station owner vaguely remembered a man fitting Mercer's description filling large jugs of water around that time. Carter asked if the man had said anything strange. The owner said he remembered Mercer asking if there were any deep wells nearby. That detail stuck. Carter searched public well registry maps and found 5 within a 20-mile radius. She visited each with a team. 4 were capped. The 5th was an old, unused structure on a defunct hunting property. The area was secluded and overgrown. The well itself was partially collapsed. A camera probe was lowered into the shaft. It revealed only dirt and debris, but near the 10-foot mark the probe picked up something strange, a metallic glint. Carter requested excavation equipment immediately. The dig began the following morning. Soil was removed carefully, layer by layer. At 12 feet, the team uncovered a steel drum. It had no labeling. The lid was rusted and sealed with bolts. Forensics sealed the perimeter and opened it slowly. Inside were charred fragments, melted plastic, and bone fragments. Carter stepped back. She could feel the weight of the air changing. The lab confirmed the remains were human. Dental records were inconclusive, but mitochondrial DNA extracted from the inner bone matched Elaine's maternal profile. The remains were Maddie's. Carter sat alone that evening, staring at the report. The case had reached its endpoint. Maddie had died sometime in the spring of 2005. The circumstances remained unknown, the cause of death undetermined. But now the silence had a resting place. Elaine came to the station in person. Carter met her in the same quiet room where they had spoken weeks earlier. Carter handed her the report and said nothing. Elaine read each word slowly, her hand never shaking. When she reached the final page, she closed the folder and looked out the window. The sun was beginning to set. She said she had known all along. She had felt the moment pass. It had been March. It had rained that entire week. She remembered feeling something cold settle in her chest. Now she had confirmation. Now she had a place to mourn. Carter offered to drive her to the burial site. Elaine said not yet. She said she wanted to sit with the folder for a while longer. Then she thanked Carter and walked out of the building. Her steps were steady, her face composed. The storm had broken. The story had reached its edge. The courtroom lights were sterile and cold. Elaine sat on the wooden bench closest to the aisle, a folded tissue clenched tightly in her right hand. She wore a black blouse and charcoal slacks, her hair tied back, her posture straight. Around her were spectators, reporters, attorneys, and a scattering of unfamiliar faces. Detective Carter sat 2 rows behind her, expression calm, notebook in her lap. Raymond Mercer stood at the defense table wearing a pale gray suit that hung loosely on his frame. His lawyer adjusted papers, whispering something in his ear. Mercer nodded, but said nothing. The judge entered, and the courtroom rose. The trial had begun. The charges were read aloud one by one. Kidnapping, false imprisonment, homicide, evidence tampering. The list continued. Mercer remained still, his eyes cast downward. Elaine did not look at him. She kept her gaze forward, her mind fixed on Maddie's voice, the one she remembered from story time and breakfast tables. That voice was no longer here to testify. Elaine had come to speak in its place. The prosecution began with the timeline. Photographs of Maddie were displayed on a screen. One showed her smiling on a swing set, another wearing the red hoodie, and a third pulled from the recovered videotapes. The attorney's voice was clear but measured, narrating the progression of events with each exhibit. He detailed the backyard disappearance, the false leads, and the storage unit discovery nearly 20 years later. Then came the evidence from the Saluda cabin, the chest, the hoodie, the burned fragments from the well. Each piece was laid out meticulously. The jury remained attentive, their expressions grave. Elaine watched as the fragments of her daughter's life were turned into arguments, into proof, into weight against the man seated a few feet away. She felt a tension grow in her chest. It was not anger. It was not grief. It was the pressure of years finally pushing forward. Detective Gay Sarter took the stand midway through the second day. She walked through the investigation's turning points. She explained the forensic discoveries, the interviews, and the analysis that led to the well. She held up the notebook found in Holt's shed, reading selected entries aloud. The courtroom was silent as Maddie's words echoed across the speakers. "I want to go home now. I had cereal with the man again. He told me I cannot open the door unless he says it is time." Carter's voice remained level, but her hands gripped the paper tightly. She described the surveillance photo of the backyard. She pointed to the aerial image showing the abandoned cabin. Then she paused, turned slightly toward the jury, and said that, in her professional opinion, this was a case of sustained captivity, psychological manipulation, and premeditated murder. The defense raised an objection. The judge overruled it. Carter stepped down without looking at Mercer. On the fourth day, the defense presented its argument. They claimed there was no direct evidence of murder. They acknowledged Mercer's connection to the properties and the storage unit, but argued there was no definitive cause of death. The defense attorney said Maddie could have died from natural causes. He said there was no sign of trauma. He implied that Mercer had taken her to protect her from a broken home, not to harm her. Elaine closed her eyes at that moment. Her hands tightened in her lap. She remembered every visit to the police department, every night spent staring at an empty bed, every holiday passed in silence. The defense tried to humanize Mercer. They mentioned his stable work history, his lack of prior arrests, his mental health challenges, but no words could erase the reality of what had been done. Elaine opened her eyes and stared directly at Mercer for the first time. He looked away. When it came time for Elaine to testify, the courtroom quieted again. She stepped up to the witness stand, her heels clicking softly against the floor. The oath was spoken. She repeated the words clearly. Then the prosecutor asked her to describe the day Maddie disappeared. She did. Her voice trembled at first, but grew steadier with each sentence. She described Maddie's favorite cereal, her love of fairy tales, the red flip-flops, the exact moment she realized her daughter was gone. She spoke of the 3 years spent searching, of Gregory's decline, of the anonymous photo, and the notebook filled with entries she would never stop reading. Then she paused, her throat tight. She said she had held on to hope longer than most would understand. She said that even when evidence began to appear, she kept believing that Maddie would come home. But now, knowing the truth, she needed to speak for the child who could not speak for herself. She asked the jury to see Maddie not as a victim, but as a person whose life had been stolen and whose voice still mattered. The cross-examination was brief. The defense asked if Elaine had ever seen Mercer act violently. She said no. They asked if she had ever heard Maddie mention him. She said no. They asked if she was aware that Maddie had shown signs of stress in school. She said all children had stress. Then the defense rested. Elaine stepped down, her hands cold but steady. As she returned to her seat, Carter gave her a slight nod. The prosecution closed with a summary of the evidence. They displayed side-by-side images of Maddie over the years. They outlined the storage locker, the cabin, the van, the well. They described a pattern of isolation and concealment. They argued that Mercer had acted deliberately, knowing each step along the way. Then they asked the jury to remember the phrase found on Maddie's final notebook page. "I want to go home now." The courtroom remained still. The judge delivered final instructions. The jury was dismissed to deliberate. Elaine waited outside with Carter and the district attorney. Hours passed. The afternoon light faded. The sky turned a soft blue-gray. Reporters paced behind the barricades, whispering into phones and typing on tablets. When the jury returned, Elaine stood once again in the courtroom. The foreperson read the verdict aloud. Guilty on all counts. Mercer did not react. Elaine exhaled sharply, eyes wet, shoulders slumped. The judge thanked the jury and set a sentencing date. The courtroom emptied slowly. Carter approached Elaine and placed a gentle hand on her back. Elaine turned and embraced her. There were no words exchanged, just quiet understanding. Outside, the air was crisp. A breeze stirred fallen leaves along the sidewalk. Elaine paused on the courthouse steps, looking out across the plaza. The trial was over. But the story would remain. In the days following the verdict, news outlets broadcast the case widely. Maddie's name became part of a larger conversation about long-term missing children and delayed justice. Elaine was asked for interviews. She declined most. She did speak once at a local school assembly where she shared Maddie's story and urged teachers and students to notice the quiet ones. She told them to believe children when they said something felt wrong. She said silence was often where the truth hid. Her voice shook, but the auditorium remained completely still. When she finished, the principal thanked her, and several students approached her afterward just to say they were sorry. Elaine left with their words tucked into her coat pocket like folded notes. At home, Elaine placed a small wooden box on the living room shelf. Inside it were Maddie's drawings, the final notebook page, and the pink sneaker. She lit a candle beside it each evening and sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the memory of her daughter's voice. There were no more questions now. Only echoes. She kept her routine steady. Coffee at sunrise, quiet walks in the afternoon. She began volunteering once a week at the library, reading to children in the back room where fairy tale books lined the shelves. Each time she opened a book, she paused, imagined Maddie beside her, and began to read. 3 weeks after the sentencing hearing, Elaine stood at the edge of the wooded clearing where the well had been unearthed. The sun was low and filtered through tall pines, casting streaks of golden light across the grass. Leaves rustled gently in the breeze, and in the distance a woodpecker tapped rhythmically against an old trunk. Elaine held a small wooden box against her chest, her arms wrapped firmly around it as if to keep its contents from dissolving into the air. Detective Carter stood a few steps away, giving her space but remaining close. They had driven out together in silence, neither feeling the need to fill the quiet. The journey had become familiar. What once felt like a place of horror now seemed to Elaine like a graveyard waiting to be named. She had requested permission from the county to install a simple marker near the site. It would not carry dates or long inscriptions, just a name and a single phrase. It was all she needed. It was all Maddie deserved. Elaine walked slowly toward the center of the clearing, where the grass had only recently begun to grow back after the excavation. A ring of earth still bore signs of the disruption, a slight dip in the terrain surrounded by stakes and flag markers. She knelt beside it, setting the box down gently on the ground. Her fingers brushed the lid, then hesitated. She had spent weeks deciding what to place inside. There were no ashes to scatter. The authorities had retained what remained for further testing. Instead, she had chosen symbols. A photo of Maddie from her 5th birthday party, still wearing chocolate frosting across her cheek. A pressed daisy from the garden Gregory once kept beside the fence. A page torn from the notebook Maddie had written in not the final entry, but one where she described the dream of building a treehouse with her grandfather. Elaine folded her hands together and closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed, her shoulders dropped, and for the first time in years she allowed herself to let go of the question that had haunted her the most. She stopped asking why. Detective Carter remained by the tree line watching the woman she had come to respect more than anyone she had ever worked with. She had never known a case to stretch so far, to cut so deep, or to demand so much from one person. Carter had read every file, examined every photograph, traced every line of the timeline until it blurred. But she had never been the one to carry its weight the way Elaine had. She thought about her own daughter, now 12, and about how fragile trust could be. She made a silent promise to listen better, to stay present, to pay attention to the unspoken things children so often carried. She looked down at the marker Elaine had chosen. It read Maddie Ross, and below it the words, "She was never forgotten." Carter knew that was true. Not for a single day. Back in Greenville, word of the trial's outcome and the recovery of Maddie's remains had changed the rhythm of the town. News vans had packed up weeks ago, and the neighborhood on Maple Ridge Lane had begun returning to its quiet routines. Still, something subtle had shifted. Neighbors waved more often. Conversations lasted a little longer. Teachers at the elementary school revised safety protocols. Churches held vigils. At the local library, a framed photo of Maddie was placed near the children's reading corner with a small plaque honoring her memory. Elaine visited once a week to volunteer, choosing a different book each time. She never mentioned Maddie by name when she read, but the children noticed her gentle smile and the way her voice softened during the sad parts. Parents often watched from a distance, sensing that something deeper lived behind the warmth in her eyes. They did not press for details. They understood that some stories were told best in the silence between lines. Elaine moved out of her father's house in early spring. It had taken her years to reach that decision. The house had become both sanctuary and prison, filled with ghosts and memories layered into the wallpaper. She sold it to a young couple expecting their first child. They promised to keep the swing in the backyard. She packed slowly, taking only what mattered. The wooden box stayed with her along with the quilt her mother had made when Maddie was born. She found an apartment overlooking the park near downtown. From her window she could see the walking path and the pond where children fed ducks. It was not a place to forget, it was a place to carry forward. She painted the living room walls pale yellow and filled the shelves with books. She bought a kettle for tea and a second chair for visitors. Though she rarely had guests, she liked the idea of being ready. Detective Carter visited her once in late April. They sat on the balcony, sipping warm drinks as the sun dipped below the buildings. Carter brought updates from the department. She said the case had prompted a review of cold case protocols. Resources were being reallocated. Training had been expanded. Carter was leading the new task force. Elaine listened carefully, nodded when appropriate, and asked thoughtful questions. Then she set her cup down and said something that Carter would remember for years. She said sometimes the only justice we get is the truth. Carter nodded and repeated the words quietly. They watched the lights flicker on across the city and did not speak again for a long while. In June, on what would have been Maddie's 28th birthday, Elaine visited the clearing one more time. She brought fresh daisies and placed them by the marker. She sat on the grass, closed her eyes, and spoke aloud. She told Maddie about the books she had read. She described the children at the library and the kindness of strangers. She said she hoped Maddie had found peace wherever she had gone. She said she would carry her memory every day. Then she opened her eyes, smiled faintly, and whispered a final goodbye. The wind passed through the trees with a gentle hush, almost like breath. Elaine brushed the grass from her knees and walked back toward the car. The story of Maddie Ross would never become a best-selling novel or a made-for-TV movie. It would not be sanitized for comfort or stretched into dramatics. It would remain what it was: the life of a little girl taken too soon, the unraveling of a man's secret world, the steady, painful path towards truth carved by a mother who refused to stop asking. It would be told in classrooms and training manuals and quiet conversations between investigators. It would become a reminder that time does not erase harm, but that perseverance can still reveal what has been hidden. Elaine would never call herself brave. She would say she did what any parent would do, but others would say she lit a path others could follow. Years later, a new plaque would be installed at the Greenville Community Center near the children's wing. It would carry no photo, only words, in memory of those who were lost but never abandoned, and in honor of those who searched until they were found. If this story moved you, take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts about the plot in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Your voice helps keep these stories alive.